The separation agreement was sitting on the kitchen counter when I got home from picking up my daughter from school. Just lying there, next to the fruit bowl, like it was a grocery list or a hydro bill. My husband was already in the living room, jacket still on, not looking at me. "I left a pen on the table," he said. That was it. No preamble. No, we need to talk. Just a pen. And a stack of papers of marriage folded into a manila envelope with a law firm's logo in the corner. I set my daughter's backpack down on the floor and told her to go wash her hands for dinner. She was 7. She went without asking questions because 7-year-olds still trust that adults have things under control. I did not have things under control. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, long enough that the light coming through the window shifted from gold to gray. I looked at the first page of the agreement. I saw a name I didn't recognize, a woman listed as a third party in the dissolution terms. My husband hadn't even told me she existed. I had to learn her name from a legal document prepared by his lawyer. Her name was Sable. I remember thinking what a strange name that was. Sable, like the color of something expensive and dark. My name is June. I'm 38 years old. I grew up in Guelph, Ontario, moved to Calgary when I was 24 for work, and that's where I met my husband, at a colleague's housewarming party, standing beside the cheese board, both of us too shy to take the last piece of brie. He was funny. He was attentive. For the first few years, he made me feel like the most important person in any room we entered together. His name doesn't matter anymore. In this story, he's just my husband. The man I chose. The man who stopped choosing me a long time before I realized it. We had one daughter together. I'll call her Zazie, because even though this story is mine, her privacy is hers to keep. At the time the separation papers landed on my counter, Maisie was in grade 2. She liked dinosaurs and hated the crusts on her sandwiches and could name every province and territory in alphabetical order. She was, without question, the only thing I had done in my life that I was completely certain about. I had left my job in marketing when Maisie was born. My husband had been rising through the ranks at his firm, an engineering consultancy, and we agreed together that it made more sense for me to stay home. I want to be honest about this. It was a real agreement. I wasn't pressured. I wanted to be there for her first words, her first steps, her first day of school. I made that choice with my whole heart. What I didn't account for was how invisible it would make me. Not to Maisie. To my husband. Somewhere around year 6 or 7, I became furniture to him. I managed our home, I raised our daughter, I coordinated his schedule, I remembered his parents' birthdays, I made sure the car insurance was renewed and the RRSP contributions went through on time. And he began to look through me like I was a window. Not even a dirty window, just glass. I started to notice things. Weekends where he was at the office. A second email account I found by accident when his laptop was open on the table. Charges on the credit card statement for restaurants I'd never been to. Hotels in Edmonton. A jewelry store on 17th Ave. I didn't confront him. I know people find that strange. But I'd read enough about this kind of thing to know that confronting someone before you're ready is the fastest way to lose your footing. So instead, I got ready. Here's what nobody tells you about being a stay-at-home parent. Your skills don't disappear. They just go underground. Before Maisie, I had built a decent career in digital marketing. I had clients, I had contacts, I had a brain that still worked just as well at 2 a.m. during a feeding as it had in a boardroom at 9 a.m. And somewhere around year 4 of my marriage, when the feeling of being invisible started to harden into something else, something that tasted like self-preservation, I started taking on freelance contracts, small ones at first. A nonprofit in Lethbridge that needed help with their social media. A consultant in Vancouver who needed copy for a rebrand. I used my maiden name. I kept a separate business account at a different bank than where we held our joint finances. I told myself it was just keeping my skills sharp. By year 11, I had a roster of regular clients, a quiet Fotstate steady sum and a savings account my husband had no idea existed. I want to be clear, I wasn't hiding money to deceive him. I was building a floor for myself. Because something in me had known for years that the ground beneath my feet wasn't solid. When you live with that feeling long enough, you stop hoping it goes away, and you start building somewhere else to stand. So when his lawyer's separation agreement appeared on my counter, with a paragraph about asset division that conveniently left out the years I'd spent holding our entire household together, I wasn't starting from zero. I was starting from a position his lawyer hadn't accounted for. I signed nothing that night. I called my own lawyer in the morning. The next 2 months were the strangest of my life. We still lived in the same house. Separate rooms. He'd moved to the basement almost immediately, which was frankly a relief. Maisie knew something was wrong the way children always do, not through information but through atmosphere. She started sleeping with her stuffed rabbit again, the one she'd outgrown the year before. My lawyer, A sharp woman named after a city in Quebec, which I always found reassuring somehow, went through the separation agreement clause by clause and called it aggressively one-sided. My husband's lawyer had valued my years out of the workforce as a liability rather than a contribution. They had structured the asset division to minimize what I'd receive from the sale of the house. They had not notably mentioned anything about the full extent of his income. But here's what his lawyer also hadn't done. She hadn't looked into the freelance work I'd built, my income, my account. In Canada, both spouses' financial situations matter in a separation. My husband had assumed I had nothing. His entire legal strategy was built on that assumption. He was wrong. 4 months after the papers appeared on the counter, the divorce was finalized. The settlement was substantially better than what he'd first offered. My lawyer had made sure of that. I got the house initially, for continuity for Maisie, but my plan was never to stay in Calgary. My plan had been forming for 2 years, quietly, the way all the best plans form, in the background, while everything else is falling apart in the foreground. My sister lived in Halifax. She'd been asking me to come east for years. And Halifax, for those who don't know it, is not the sleepy maritime backwater people imagine. It's a city with a real tech industry, real creative sector, a tightening housing market that still had room, and the ocean. I had always needed to be near water to think clearly. 2 weeks after the settlement was signed, I put the Calgary house on the market, enrolled Maisie in a school near my sister's neighborhood, and booked 2 one-way flights to Halifax Stanfield. My husband found out when Maisie mentioned it at a handoff. He called me that night, furious. "You can't just move provinces with her." "I can," I said. "My lawyer filed the notice." "Your lawyer should have called you." He hadn't read his own paperwork carefully enough. Another assumption he'd made about me, that I wouldn't know my own rights. The first week in Halifax felt like stepping into cold water. Not bad cold, clarifying cold. My sister had a spare room ready. She and her partner had set it up for Maisie, with a little drawing of the Atlantic Ocean taped to the wall, done in crayon by their own kids. Maisie cried when she saw it. Good crying, the kind that releases something. I stood in the doorway and watched my daughter unpack her stuffed rabbit and her dinosaur books, and I felt something shift in my chest. A loosening. We stayed with my sister for 6 weeks while I found us a rental. I had the capital from the house settlement and my savings account, and I knew the local rental market from 3 months of obsessive research. I'd been looking at listings in Halifax the same way some people scroll social media, late at night, quietly hopeful. I found us a 2-bedroom on the peninsula, walking distance from the water, 10 minutes from Maisie's new school. It needed some work. The kitchen faucet dripped and the bathroom needed paint, and the backyard was a disaster. I loved it immediately. The first night we slept there, Maisie and I had breakfast for dinner, scrambled eggs and toast and orange juice in paper cups, because our glasses were still in a box somewhere. And we sat on the floor of the empty living room and listened to the foghorn somewhere out in the harbor, and she said, "Mayman, do you think the dolphins can hear that too?" I told her I thought they probably could. She seemed satisfied with that. I want to tell you about the day everything came together. But to understand it, you need to know about Sable. I'd done what anyone does. I looked her up. She wasn't difficult to find. She had a public Instagram, a lifestyle of brunches and gym selfies and couples photos with my husband that started appearing about 8 months before he handed me those papers. She was 29. She had very good hair. She worked in real estate. I had no particular feelings about her appearance or her age. I was past that kind of pain. What I noticed was something else. She was, by about 6 months into my research, visibly pregnant. My husband hadn't told me about this either. He had mentioned it to Maisie, though, dropped it into conversation during a phone call, casual as weather, which sent my daughter to me in tears on a Tuesday night, asking if she was going to have a brother or sister she'd never get to see. I held Maisie for a long time that night. I told her this was her dad's news to share properly, not mine to explain. I told her she was loved completely and specifically, and that nothing about this changed that. Then I waited. My ex-husband was bringing Maisie back to Halifax for a long weekend in March. A trip he'd arranged through our parenting coordinator. He was flying in from Calgary, staying at a hotel downtown. He'd told me, through his lawyer, that he and Sable planned to use the trip to see a local specialist. Sable was high risk, something about her blood pressure. And would I mind if Maisie came to the appointment just to bond? I minded. But more than that, I noticed something about the timing he'd mentioned, the dates, the week of the appointment he'd referenced. I'd been quietly doing some arithmetic ever since I'd first seen those Instagram photos, and the numbers didn't quite add up to the story he'd told me. The one where Sable was a new relationship only started after we separated, nothing to do with why our marriage had ended. I said nothing. I waited. The weekend arrived. My sister came to stay with me while Maisie went with her father. A precaution, because I had learned by then not to be alone on hard days. The call came at 4:47 on a Saturday afternoon. It wasn't from my ex-husband. It was from Maisie. She was at the clinic, an OB-GYN office at the QEI Health Sciences Center, and she was upset, talking fast. I had to ask her to slow down twice. What had happened was this. The specialist had brought up the results of the prenatal genetic screening. Standard procedure, nothing alarming. But in reviewing the blood work, and here is where my arithmetic turned out to be relevant. The gestational age the specialist confirmed did not match the conception timeline my ex-husband had told me, had told his lawyer, had told anyone who asked. The baby was not, as he'd claimed, conceived after our separation. He had been standing in that examination room, holding Sable's hand when the doctor read out the dates, and he had gone very still. Sable had looked at him. He had looked at the floor. Maisie had not fully understood what she was witnessing. But she had seen her father's face do something she'd never seen it do before, and she'd felt frightened enough to call me. "Mama," she said. Dad looked like someone told him something really bad. "I know, baby. Are you somewhere safe? I'm in the waiting room." Dad and Sable are still in the room. "Okay, can you ask the receptionist to sit with you? Tell her your mom asked." She did. The receptionist stayed with her. 40 minutes later, my ex-husband came out to the waiting room and drove Maisie back to his hotel without saying anything to her about what had happened. He sent me a text that night. It said only, "I need to talk to my lawyer. Here's what happened after that," in plain language. Because the conception date predated our legal separation, the family law implications were significant. In Canada, assets acquired during a marriage, including, in some interpretations, obligations incurred, are subject to equalization. The fact that he'd misrepresented the timeline of his relationship with Sable was now relevant not just emotionally but legally. My lawyer filed an application to have certain terms of our settlement reviewed. It took several more months. There were more documents, more emails, more conversations through intermediaries. It was exhausting in the way that any prolonged legal process is exhausting. Not dramatic, just grinding. But the outcome was different from what his original lawyer had planned for me. He had built his strategy on a version of events that wasn't true. And when that version unraveled, not because I'd fought dramatically or confronted him in some public way, but because reality has a habit of surfacing eventually, the strategy unraveled with it. By the time it was fully over, it was almost summer. Halifax in June is something else. The city wakes up. The harbor fills with sailboats. The restaurants put their patios out, and people sit outside in the evening, like they're making up for 6 months of lost light. Maisie had finished her first year at her new school, with a best-has friend named Priya, and a newfound obsession with tidal pools. She'd stopped sleeping with the rabbit. She'd started sleeping with a field guide to Atlantic marine life instead. My freelance business had grown. The Halifax market had been better than I'd hoped, and I'd picked up 2 anchor clients within the first 4 months of arriving. I was working from home, around Maisie's schedule, and for the first time in years I felt like all the different parts of my life were occupying the same space at the same time. One evening in late June, my sister came over for dinner. She brought her partner and their kids, and we ate on the back deck of my rental, the one with the terrible yard that I'd slowly been reclaiming. And afterward, the children ran around in the long evening light while we sat with our wine and didn't say very much because there wasn't much that needed saying. My phone buzzed. A notification from my bank. A transfer had cleared. I looked at the number for a moment. Then I put the phone face down on the table and watched my daughter try to catch fireflies with her cousin, and I thought about the woman I'd been the night I stood in a Calgary kitchen, looking at a pen left on a counter. She had no idea what was coming. Neither did he. The fireflies kept rising out of the dark grass, small lights appearing and disappearing in the summer air, and Maisie laughed every time she missed one, not frustrated, just delighted that they kept surprising her. And I thought, yes, that's the right response. You keep reaching anyway. You let yourself be surprised. I picked up my glass and finished my wine and let the evening do what evenings in Halifax do in June. Go on, gently longer than you expected, right up until the moment the sky finally softly goes dark.